I thought you were a visiting scholar or Technology Serving Humanity Speaker Series. This is a new public lecture series launched by the FedEx Institute of Technology. It focuses on the social, political, legal, ethical, and philosophical aspects of technology with the aim of broadening our understanding of technology's impacts. National and international scholars from the humanities, fine arts, communication, and the social sciences will be joining us this year. You can find out more about this series at the FedEx Institute of Technology website. Check the chat for a link. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Moya Bailey, Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Bailey is a scholar of critical race, feminist, and disability studies. Her work explores how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and in medicine. In particular, her research focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. She currently curates the #TransformDH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities. She is also the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. She is a co-author of #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice with Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells, that's MIT Press 2020, and the author of Misogynoir Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance, NYU Press 2021. Her talk today is titled, Can We Have an Ethical Internet? Welcome, Dr. Bailey.
So much for having this sunlight. I'm trying to decide if it's better for me to be forward or backward, but I'm gonna try it from here. And feel free to put in the chat if you're having trouble seeing me. As I said, I am so excited to be here, and I want to thank you for coming to this virtual talk, and thank you, Deborah, for inviting me, and also Mary Ann for all of her logistical help in making this visit possible. Next slide, please. I'm joining you all virtually from the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi nations, many other tribes such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sac, and Fox also call this area home. And I was really moved by a non-land acknowledgement that I heard earlier during this pandemic time, in which Indigenous elders made clear that land acknowledgements are not enough, and that sometimes even doing a land acknowledgement can help white supremacy relax. And while I don't wish to help white supremacy relax, when it comes to our turn to the digital in these pandemic times, it can be easy to forget that there is hardware that runs all over Turtle Island that connects our digital devices, and that this hardware is made from minerals extracted from stolen land and mined by exploited people around the world. So when discussing my work and its social justice implications, I cannot forget the too often invisibilized logics of settler colonialism that can become even harder to see or acknowledge with our need to turn towards digital technology in the time of COVID-19. And this will be a large part of what I'm talking about today. Next slide, please. My talk is divided into 3 parts, and I'll begin with a bit about what is unethical about the internet, a dive into some of the current infrastructural challenges that make the internet unethical. And then I'll talk about my discipline of digital humanities and how I think it might begin to help us get to another place. And I'll end with some thoughts for the future of what might be obtainable. So maybe we can't get to an ethical internet, but maybe we can have something that is a little bit more equitable. And the digital humanities, as I understand it, involves using digital tools to answer questions in the humanities that it might otherwise be impossible to answer, or asking humanities questions of digital tools. It's this latter line of inquiry where my digital humanities projects are centered. I'm always looking for the hidden human in the digital infrastructure. The ways in which people's identities inform both theory and practice in digital humanities, I feel have been largely overlooked. So those already marginalized in society and in the academy can also find themselves in the liminal spaces of this field. And so my work centers the lives of women, people of color, disabled folks, and I'm really interested in the types of conversations that can help this field shift. The move from margin to center offers the opportunity to engage new sets of theoretical questions that expose implicit assumptions about what and who counts in digital humanities, as well as exposes structural limitations that are the inevitable result of an unexamined identity politics of whiteness, masculinity, and able-bodiedness. So my previous work really focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. My book project, Misogynoir Transformed, pushes for understanding the social media content created by Black women as media designed to change health outcomes within Black communities through challenging damaging stereotypes with self-fashioned representations. I created the portmanteau misogynoir to name that specific combination of anti-Black and misogynistic representation in visual culture and digital spaces that shapes broader ideas about Black women. And I argue that the process of making hashtags, web series, and images online provides not only a stigma management strategy, but also provides opportunities to grow resilient strategies offline, like advocating skills and that mitigate the disproportionate life-threatening violence that these communities experience. And so I'd like to think about the need for fostering an ethical digital culture or an ethical internet that includes the digital humanities, taking a more political approach to our work. So thinking about how we can start to see the humanities and technology. And I believe we can use the little bit of Western institutional privilege we have to try and imagine a way of engaging the digital that is more ethical for all. So I'm gonna start with 3 case studies, all of which currently fall outside the purview of the digital humanities. But my hope is to show that these issues should matter to those of us who are doing research at these intersections. Next slide, please. In an October 2018 article in The Guardian, Harvard lecturer Siddharth Kara describes the backbreaking work of searching for coltan by 15-year-old Elodie, who is exposed to toxic dust in the process. Elodie sells her coltan to Chinese distributors who export and refine the mineral in China, then sell it to tech companies to power our digital devices, such as smartphones, laptops, and tablets. Due largely to activism from local Congolese groups and NGOs, the US passed the Dodd-Frank Act, which prohibits any commodity traded through the SEC from having conflict minerals in its supply chain. So in theory, this seems like a helpful provision, a way to ensure that companies take these human rights abuses and conflict profiteering now embedded in the digital supply chain seriously. However, most of these workers are like Elodie, involved in what is called artisanal small-scale mining, which the Dodd-Frank Act has little oversight. And so it doesn't actually provide that much help. In September 2019, China Labor Watch released a report revealing numerous labor rights violations at the Jingzhou Foxconn factory, the largest iPhone factory in the world, and known for its infamous suicide nets that surround its dormitories so that workers won't kill themselves if they decide to jump, as many before them have. And just this last year, China was accused of forcing Uyghur Muslims to work at factories that produce goods for well-known global companies, including Apple, Nike, BMW, Samsung, Sony, and Volkswagen. And these human rights violations have been brought to the attention of these companies before, but like the Dodd-Frank Act, the kind of interventions designed to ameliorate these issues never seem to reach those most in need. In October of 2019, South Carolina granted Google a 4-year contract to allow them to extract and use 549 million gallons of groundwater a year to cool its latest data center in the state. And that last picture is a picture of that data site. Clay Duffy, manager of Mount Pleasant Waterworks, opposed the transaction, explaining, "I don't have a beef against Google itself, but I don't think it's appropriate to use pristine groundwater for cooling computers versus providing that water for people. We are obviously concerned about the long-term, safe, sustainable yield of that aquifer." The population of the state is growing. And I would say additionally, one of the outcomes of COVID-19 has been an increased need for personal water consumption. So these data centers provide very little in the way of new jobs for the communities that host them, despite the promised increase used as a selling point. Google was wooed by tax breaks and a large amount of fresh water, but the long-term effects of that water supply for South Carolinians has yet to unfold. So as Elodie and 35,000 other Congolese children and upwards of 80,000 Uyghurs negotiate dangerous working conditions that impair their health, some Western consumers enjoy the fruits of their debilitating labor to fight for their own rights in the ableist infrastructure of the West. Additionally, Americans and people around the world benefit from the cooling power of the aquifer in South Carolina, water that is in the ground traditionally stewarded by the Catawba, the PD, the Chicora, the Edisto, Santi, Yamasee, Chicora-Wakama, who are still present in South Carolina, as are many descendants of the Cherokee, despite also being devastated by European-born diseases like smallpox. What are the ethical implications of using stolen water on stolen land to cool the data centers that power the internet? How might a new set of relations between consumers, laborers, and land create the kind of advocacy that would force corporate entities to change their policies? If they have to be accountable to all of these entities, what role should our studies of the digital play in addressing these problems in the global digital supply chain? The language of supply chain due diligence has shaped the conversation of what needs to happen to ensure a more humane production process. Like the euphemistic triangle trade that obscures the buying and selling of enslaved Africans as commodities, supply chain due diligence masks the human rights concerns of the supply chain. Due diligence may allay consumer fears of using conflict minerals, but does not actually change the material conditions of those working on the ground. Many of the articles I've read articulate these issues as solvable with needed transparency in the supply chain and focus on commercial transactions, rather than directly address the investment in cheap labor at the expense of the lives of Black Congolese or Uyghur Muslim workers living in the global South. Despite the fact that it was the human rights violations and violence they faced that was instrumental in getting reforms off the ground, nation states have opted to let corporations try to regulate themselves through internal oversight mechanisms and practices. I believe that the digital humanities as a field is primed for the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that could be beneficial in shifting some of these harmful realities for the people who build digital infrastructure and hardware. My co-conceived method of a Black feminist disability framework centers race, gender, and disability, challenging these generally siloed theories to work together to better understand the realities for those multiply marginalized within society. With a Black feminist disability framework, we can begin to actualize theoretical interventions that challenge mainstream news narratives that erase race and gender and forestall the ableism used to explain away debilitating labor practices. It's through praxis that we can start to create a new scholarship that is informed not just by our critical inquiries, but also by our resulting actions and processes that shift previous paradigms of understanding. A Black feminist disability framework centers a critique of capitalism and labor because of the variability both in gender for those who are multiply marginalized. While Black studies has been successful in critiquing US labor practices, it has not gone so far as to critique work itself. Jobs with dignity still assume that people are able to work a job that has the traditional 9-to-5 structure and that makes sense. The globalizing socioeconomic system demands more and more labor for less and less pay and fewer safety requirements. And that's meant that Black Congolese are literally working themselves to death. While karoshi, the Japanese word for overwork deaths, has gotten some attention in international news media, the phenomenon is mostly regarded as spectacle. The middle and upper middle class workers who succumb to karoshi are not thought of alongside immigrant farm workers who die slowly of cancer after being exposed to Monsanto chemicals. Whether it's the produce you buy or the computer you use to Instacart it, hidden in the supply chain are the exploited people who make your life easier. Adopting a Black feminist disability framework gives scaffolding with which to think in generative ways about the intersectional nature of supply chain oppression. I use this framework to create a strategy for addressing the way that digital infrastructure impacts communities in the global North and South differently. I see my work building on the work of other disability scholars who are interested in rethinking the inevitability of these dire consequences on human life. By adopting an ethics of pace in our scholarly practice, I contend we can disrupt debilitating patterns in academia and beyond. I'm arguing for a slowed down digital humanities, or even to use the language of this series, a more humane technology, a more humane way of regulating and dealing with technology that values moving at the speed of trust, which requires a more democratized relationship to time. Because digital humanities is already attentive to collaborative scholarship, a slow DH would also allow for moments of reflection so that multiple collaborators from different vantage points are valued. I offer the model of slow DH as a possibility model, to use trans activist Laverne Cox's term, for an ethics of pace in the academy that is attentive to the ways that race, gender, sexuality, class, and ability inform our work together. Slow digital humanities has the potential to be an evocative example for other fields. And in this process, or in this work, I privilege process over product, arguing that the way we treat each other through our work is much more important than the resulting output. So I've tried to be someone who walks my talk. So in my collaborative digital humanities work, I have not been able to force things to move faster than this speed of trust. Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy offers some solutions. In this book, Brown describes 9 principles that inform her beliefs around organizing. And it's principle number 7 that calls for people to focus on critical connections more than critical mass, to build the resilience by building the relationships. And I think if we invest first in the relationships between people, it won't matter if we are few in number. I want to prioritize the work of growing bonds between people before attempting to create more rigorous scholarship. This principle is a testament to the collaborative nature of an ethic of pace, and one that needs to move at the speed of trust. And the speed of trust is also connoting that slowing down a need to nurture relationships before trust can be established. So when I was working on my book, Misogynoir Transformed: Black Women's Digital Resistance, I created a community advisory board that consisted of Black women and non-binary folks who use social media platforms for social justice organizing. This small cadre of collaborators helped me to shape my research questions and challenged me to be more mindful about the information I shared publicly from my research. I was so focused on how their collaboration was useful to me, I didn't think about how the collaboration might be useful to them. And I wrote a piece about this in Digital Humanities Quarterly, talking about how one of the members of this group actually found that they had built enough trust amongst themselves that they were able to do work that resonated with them in ways that I couldn't have thought of as the principal investigator of the project. So my own research was really strengthened by the connections that the group made with each other. And that was only possible because of the extended time that bringing the group together digitally provided. And we really had this opportunity through creating collaborative space together to open up new possibilities in my research and theirs that I could never have anticipated. An ethics of pace that moves at the speed of trust protects against possible disruptions because people and process are more important than profits and products. And in my book, also mentioned at the top of the talk, hashtag activism. Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells and I, we all come from different methodological traditions, which we brought together to achieve that text. And it's definitely a text that neither of us could have written individually. And so the speed of trust we built together developed over different timelines, given our different relationships to each other within the academy. And over the course of weekly writing sessions, we got to know one another better and felt compelled to collaborate on the book. And then the process of writing it, we knew we needed to include the voices of the hashtag activists that motivated us. So we solicited hashtag creators and paid them for short contributions in which they discussed their relationships to the hashtags they started. Additionally, as someone who had worked closely with Twitter users as collaborators before, I wanted to give the users whose tweets we referenced a more transparent experience with academics using their tweets in scholarship. I wanted to provide notice that we had used their tweets and give them an option to opt out of seeing their handles next to words that they didn't want their handle associated with. So they had the option to opt out of seeing their handle or exact words within the text. We collected every handle that we used in the book, and for every personal non-celebrity account, we reached out directly to seek consent to use their handle and tweet in the book. And this process, obviously took some time, but it was essential to our ethos of trying to move at the speed of trust and also thinking about how we could be ethical in our relationship to these collaborators. And as I have been thinking about this, I've been thinking about the collaborators that we see ourselves connected to, and then the collaborators that we already have as being members of the academy. Librarians, engineers, and other faculty have already been collaborative architects of many of the digital humanities projects that are central to the fields, including community members, people in the digital infrastructure supply chain as part of this already collaborative team, means incorporating elements of participatory action research that allows for community and human rights interests to be served, not just the researcher's interests. So I really feel like there's a way that when we include community collaborators from the beginning, our research becomes all the more impactful. As my work develops, I hope to be in collaboration with those organizing within the mineral mines of the Congo, the union seekers at Foxconn, as well as the people of South Carolina. As COVID-19 has made undeniably clear, we are all connected in this world, whether we believe it or not. In Alice Walker's classic text, "We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For," "Inner Light in a Time of Darkness," she writes, "This is a time when consciousness really requires that we connect, that we don't just say, oh, that's them over there." Because the other part of consciousness now is to understand there are no other people anywhere. They are all here on the planet. We are us, and that's it. We are all just degrees from one another. Building solidarity across state, institutional, disciplinary, and professional lines is essential if humans are to survive on this planet. The digital humanities is not the only field attempting to do this important collaborative work, but it's the one I'm most familiar with and where I see the built-in potential to move at the speed of trust. The people in the process by which they are engaged are an essential part of this scholarship. I offer that what is necessary is a new ethic around pace that doesn't allow capitalism to be the driving force of our decision-making as a species. An ethics of pace in our scholarship means that the ends do not justify the means, but rather the means are the ends. By remaining attentive to the people involved in our research, keeping the human at the center of digital humanities, we can create a process that does not cause harm or at least reduces it. And so I've been thinking about these questions definitely in regards to this ethical internet. And I am a so-called elder millennial, even though I strongly prefer the term Oregon Trail generation. But I feel like I hold this unique distinction of being in this last cohort of kids to know life without the ubiquity of the internet. I remember life before cell phones turned smartphones, when payphones still worked, and I remember that jump from 10 cents to a quarter. So this straddling of epochs has shaped my questions about the internet and its presence in everyday life, prompting me to consider the ethics of our use of this technology, as well as the ethics of the infrastructure that supports it. And so this gets to the larger question of this talk. How can we ethically engage a military-derived technology that has infiltrated every aspect of our lives, from refrigerators to furniture? The weaponizing potential of the internet was partial to its initial conceit, yet this history is often forgotten and therefore remains unconnected to the current violence that this life-changing technology has enabled around the world. The question of an ethical internet literally keeps me up at night and animates one of the first classes that I'll be teaching at Northwestern in the winter quarter. While there can be no ethical engagement with the internet under capitalism, I do think there is a less harmful path for our web wandering to take, one that my students and I will begin to explore in 2022. So as a member of this micro generation, I am a unique tour guide for this experimental reimagining of the internet at the end of the Anthropocene. And I would say my scholarly focus on the ethics of the digital humanities has been redirecting my attention to the digital supply chain. And that has really made me consider all of the hidden human labor that went into the creation of those platforms. And, can we have an ethical internet also creates these other questions. On what land could one build a server with ethically sourced minerals and water to cool said servers? With planned obsolescence built into all of the tech we consume, can we recycle and refurbish old electronic parts to create the computers, servers, and hubs we need to build our own network? Can we solve e-waste on land, in sea, and in space? And who will monitor these servers, tend to them when they inevitably crash, having been reanimated from their facilitated and fated early ends? So I think the answer to these questions requires a bit of fictional science as deployed by Banu Subramaniam in her compelling text, Ghost Stories for Darwin. In chapter 3, Singing the Morning Glory Blues, Subramaniam tells the fictional story of 3 childhood best friends and their love for a field of morning glories near their home as a way to explore what a just scientific practice could be. The girls are inadvertently inspired to be interdisciplinary scholars by the strict disciplinary boundaries observed by the adults who study the field of flowers via their own strict fields of study. Kahani of Raisani collects soil samples with grad students to do his research, while the Pundit of Pujam uses math to make sense of the flowers. The dozen or so researchers don't talk to each other, and when they do, it does not go well. And the girls hatch a plan to bring the investigators together, but after a night of food and fun, the sated scientists attempt to talk to each other, only to storm off upset by their ideological differences. The girls take the scientists' different approaches to heart, ultimately becoming scientists themselves and working collaboratively with each other and their communities to create research that transforms their world. So some 35 years later, they have a center to study their beloved morning glories, which was created with the town's cooperation and input. And so they have really seen what might be possible if you work together. So that really inspired my thinking of what an ethical internet could look like. Next slide. So I imagine a future life on a server farm commune where I tend to the whirs and beeps, turned flashes of light powered by the sun and wind. I am a modern day Dr. Ellie Arroway, if you've seen Contact. But instead of listening to hours of space static, hoping for contact, I nurture a small but mighty intermeshed network of connection that didn't require additional human exploitation beyond what was initially required to render the recycled machines used. The community of server farmers exists on land in right relation with the traditional stewards of the region. I envision one such server from outside the city limits of Detroit, where the Anishinaabe, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and Potawatomi have navigated the land for centuries. Our presence was sanctioned by the indigenous communities that traditionally use the land, and they have access to all the servers they want and need. We work together to make sure our disruption of the regular comings and goings of flora and fauna are minimized, finding natural clearings and erecting structures that fit the landscape and diffuse the energy and heat generated by the power required to run the servers. To that end, there are internet quiet hours where the internet sleeps as we do. Light pollution is eradicated and electrical waves reduced. We can communicate with similar such communities around the world by essentially writing letters back and forth that may reach our pen pals instantly, but are only opened in the light of day in the time zone received. So given the taxing nature of internet use on the environment, we make every effort to limit our internet connectivity and to use it judiciously. We also work to harness natural energy sources through new tech like lightning collectors and ambient energy harvesters. We move at the speed of trust and the speed of our circadian rhythm, remaining conscious of the pace at which we want our lives to proceed. We grow food on the farm in addition to the internet, reusing the bits of e-waste that can't be refurbished or recycled for fences or planters. Kids learn to code as they learn to plant. We learn how to solder our own servers, creating the technology we need at a sustainable pace. We eat well and have digital dance parties. It's a different way of relating to the world, IRL and online. So maybe, just maybe, this just technological future is possible if we are willing to slow down and move with intention. We may not be able to have a truly ethical internet before the end of Homo sapiens, but we can definitely reduce the harm that our use of the internet engenders if we try. Thank you very much for your time. Last slide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. That's wonderful. We have time for some questions. I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A, so I'll start off. I'll ask, I love the idea of a kind of moving at the pace of trust. It's an amazing idea and certainly needed in terms of when you think of what the relationship requires in order to build trust, we need to slow down. But I wonder in terms of how fast technology is moving, how is that possible? I worry that us slowing down is actually going to, technology is going to surpass us to the point at which we're kind of behind what needs to be done.
That's a great question. I mean, I think this is also why it's so important to do work that's collaborative, so that if you're working with young people who I think are often some of the first and early adopters of some of the newer technology, then you'll get the opportunity to learn as you go, and you won't have that sense that you're missing out. Additionally, I think part of slowing down creates the opportunity for you to develop skills that allow you to anticipate and be ready for whatever is coming next. So again, if we are moving at the speed of trust, then we will be able to meet technology where it lands.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank Dr. Bailey again for joining us. And
I think there's some.
There's a couple of questions.
oh, great. Good. It was a little slow on my end. Great. How do you manage your mental health when researching such heavy information?
That's a great question, Carl. I'd say one of the ways that I have been able to manage the heaviness of it all is to do it in batches. So I try to deal with a lot of it all at once and then give myself lots of time in between. So I have done well with a feast and famine approach, I would say, of dealing with a lot of the difficult topics of the research at one time, and then doing some of the more administrative tasks related to my research at another time, so that I can give myself a bit of a break from how difficult it is.
And we have a question. Do you see the field as turning its attention to infrastructure issues?
Yeah, I mean, I was part of the first part of what I was reading today was part of a panel at the American Studies Association conference that was in Hawaii. And at that conference, we had a panel that was specifically about supply chain concerns. And I also thought it was important that we were having that conversation in Hawaii. And the conference did a lot to make sure that we understood what it meant to be trapped in Hawaii at that time. It was definitely an interesting moment, given that Native Hawaiians are calling on people not to visit the island right now because of COVID. So I think at that time, it really gave us another sense of how this digital supply chain, the supply chain more generally, is affecting Indigenous communities. You could see in the context of an island what it meant to have this huge conference come in that on the one hand was useful in supporting the local economy, but then also was a drain in so many other ways in terms of the resources that people had access to. So those questions were very on the minds of the conference planners. And I think going forward, I don't imagine that we'll have another conference in Hawaii, given those people wanting to be attentive to those questions and not do that again.
Okay, this next question says, they wonder if you could talk a bit about how to approach slow DH within the context of the tenure and promotion evaluation strategies of the academy. It seems incredibly difficult to convince administrations of the value of slow work.
That's such a great question. And I think you're absolutely right. It has meant for me often doing multiple projects. So it has not meant that I've done less work, it's meant that I've done more. But it does have its advantages in that working with Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells is part of what I think made me legible to a communications department, which was not my field. But writing the book, #activism, together is, I think, part of how I got my job at Northwestern. So I think even as administrators are slow to value it, there are ways that it ends up being valued anyway. For me, it has just meant trying to make sure that I'm doing the things that are also required of me, and then the slow DH as well. And one thing I will say about slow DH is that it does give you an opportunity to talk not just about the product of the work, but also the process. So a lot of my writing, a lot of my publications have been on the process of doing the work, not just the work itself, which I think is one way to make it legible to administrators, and one way to make it useful to you and that time investment useful to you.
Well, there's lots of very positive comments here, both in the chat and the Q&A. Are there any other questions? I think the tenure and promotion issue is really crucial, not only for the slow issue, but the interdisciplinary issue. I think a lot of the tenure and promotion guidelines, a lot of T&P committees don't really understand or know how to assess interdisciplinary work. So that those are issues too that I think need to be taken into account.
Absolutely. And when I was at Northeastern, we started to kind of think about this and really trying to get our humanities and social science disciplines to look at the sciences as a model.
Yeah.
And think about how the sciences have been really good at supporting collaborative work and evaluating collaborative work. And so might there be models from the natural sciences that can then be applied to understand just what is possible when people work together, and that it takes more time. And again, it's also where you see the papers that come out related to the same topic, but at different stages of the life cycle of a project. And I really think that that would be something that we do well to replicate.
Right. Okay, any last questions? Thanks again, Dr. Bailey. And thanks for you all joining us and for the great questions. Join us in October for our next speaker. Michael Lynch will be giving a talk. We've changed that. He, unfortunately, because of COVID, he's coming on a Tuesday afternoon instead of a Friday. So please check the website for our next talk. Thanks again, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you again, Dr. Bailey.
It's been a pleasure. Bye, everyone.